Hello, brave hearts, and welcome back to Girls Who Rise, a place for imagination, for courage, and stories that grow right alongside you. Today we continue our journey through Anne of Green Gables, where a few unforgettable mistakes are waiting for Anne in Avonlea. Last time, Anne learned that pride and fear can sometimes push us into choices we never meant to make. After trying to prove she wasn't afraid, she found herself hurt, embarrassed, wondering how one moment could feel so awful and so comforting at the very same time. Because even after mistakes, even after feeling foolish, there were still people who cared for her deeply. So, before we step back into Avonlea, let's take one slow breath in and a gentle breath out. Let your shoulders soften. This is a place for you, a place for stories, brave hearts, and all the feelings that come with growing up. But before we get back into our story, here is a story note. This story was written a long time ago by L.M. Montgomery and has been gently abridged for listening. Abridged means some parts have been shortened a little or made easier to follow out loud, but it's still Anne's story. So settle in, get cozy, and let's return now to Avonlea, Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery. Chapter 27. Spring was coming. Avonlea changed slowly, one dripping rooftop at a time, one softer breeze at a time, one tiny bird singing from a fence post at a time. One afternoon, the students were settling noisily into their desks when Miss Stacy entered the schoolroom carrying several papers and wearing an unusually bright expression. She set the papers down carefully on her desk. "I have something special to discuss with all of you." She stepped in front of the classroom. "In a few weeks, we are going to perform a play for everyone here in Avonlea." The entire classroom burst into excited chatter. "There will be costumes, scenery, rehearsals, and performances, and every one of you will help." Anne felt excitement rush through her so suddenly it almost hurt. A real play, with characters and costumes and lines to memorize. Beside her, Diana grabbed her sleeve excitedly. "Oh, Anne, won't it be exciting?" "Exciting is far too small a word for it," Anne whispered back. Miss Stacy began assigning parts for the play. Some students would help paint scenery and arrange props. Others would help move pieces on and off the stage between scenes. Several students would have speaking roles. When Miss Stacy announced that Anne would have one of the leading parts, Anne pressed both hands together tightly beneath her desk to stop herself from smiling too widely. A real part in the play, with lines to memorize and scenes to perform. It sounded wonderfully important. The rest of the school day passed in complete disorder. No one could concentrate properly afterwards. Every mind in the room was busy imagining costumes, lights, and rehearsals instead. Outside after school, Anne and Diana walked slowly while muddy water splashed beneath their boots. The wind lifted loose strands of Anne's red hair as she gazed up into the cloudless blue sky. "Diana," she sighed dreamily, "don't you feel as though something exciting is just waiting ahead of us?" Diana nodded immediately. That was one of the nicest things about Diana. Anne had never had to explain her feelings completely. Somehow, Diana understood them anyway. Over the next several weeks, every afternoon after school, students stayed behind to rehearse for the play. Miss Stacy moved calmly, helping students practice scenes and memorize lines while papers fluttered everywhere and chairs scraped endlessly across the floor. Someone was always forgetting what came next. Someone else kept missing their entrance entirely. And more than once, the entire room burst into laughter after a dramatic scene accidentally turned ridiculous. But somehow Miss Stacy made all of it feel exciting instead of chaotic. Anne loved every minute. She practiced her lines constantly. Sometimes she imagined the audience sitting completely still beneath the lights, listening so carefully that they forgot to breathe. One evening, Marilla looked up from peeling potatoes as Anne swept dramatically into the kitchen reciting lines with one hand pressed against her heart. "Although the storm may beat against the—" For pity's sake, Anne, Marilla interrupted. Watch where you're going before you walk straight into the stove. Finally, the evening of the concert arrived. Families and neighbors slowly filled the room with excited voices and laughter. Backstage, the students crowded together nervously. "You're nervous?" Diana whispered. "I'm terrified," Anne whispered back, "but in an exciting sort of way." Diana frowned slightly. "That sounds dreadful." "It is a little dreadful," Anne admitted, "but I think important things sometimes feel that way." Miss Stacy moved through the backstage room, helping students with costumes, fixing loose buttons and calming nervous actors, and offering encouragement. "Remember," she told them gently, "you do not have to be perfect. Just do your best." The play began. Scenes unfolded, one after another, and beneath the warm lights, while nervous students hurried on and off the stage. Some forgot lines and had to pause awkwardly before continuing. One boy entered far too early and stood in the wrong scene entirely, making the audience laugh kindly. Nobody seemed upset by little mistakes. Backstage, Anne waited nervously for her first scene. Then someone whispered, "You're next." Anne's heart pounded wildly as she stepped onto the stage beneath the lights. For one terrible second, the audience looked enormous. Rows and rows of faces blurred together in the glowing room. What if the words disappeared completely the moment she opened her mouth? Then she spotted Matthew sitting quietly beside Marilla. Matthew gave the smallest little nod. That simple gesture steadied her immediately. Anne took a breath and began. She forgot herself, forgot the audience, forgot her fear. The auditorium grew completely still. As Anne spoke her lines, something unexpected began happening. Little by little, she stopped noticing the audience quite so much. She stopped thinking about how nervous she felt or whether everyone was watching her. For a little while, it no longer felt like pretending at all. It felt real. And suddenly Anne understood something she had never fully realized before. Stories could make complete strangers feel the same thing at the same time. That felt almost magical. When the final scene ended, applause burst through the hall. Her cheeks flushed bright pink as she hurried breathlessly backstage. Diana threw her arms around her immediately. "You were wonderful." "Do you truly think so?" Anne asked. "I know so." Even Miss Stacy looked proud. Much later that evening, Anne walked quietly beside Matthew and Marilla toward Green Gables. Far away, laughter still drifted down the road from families heading home. "I think," Anne said softly, "that this has been one of the happiest evenings of my life." "You did do very well," Marilla admitted. Matthew just looked proud. Anne smiled in the darkness as they walked home beneath the stars. And somewhere up ahead, waiting just beyond springtime in Avonlea, even more stories were beginning to grow. Chapter 28. Story Club is formed. After the school play, school no longer felt quite as ordinary. Excitement lingered around the school for days afterwards. Students still whispered about funny mistakes during lessons and talked about their favorite scenes while walking home together after school. Anne loved the feeling of everyone carrying a little piece of that special evening with them. One windy afternoon after school, Anne, Diana, Ruby Gillis, Jane Andrews, and several others wandered slowly along the road near the berry orchard. Anne was in the middle of describing a story idea she had begun imagining during math class. "It's about a beautiful young lady," Anne explained dramatically, "who is separated from her true love after a terrible misunderstanding involving a storm at sea and a lost letter." "Does anyone die?" Ruby asked hopefully. "Possibly several people," Anne admitted. "I have not yet entirely decided." Diana laughed softly beside Anne. "You always think life should be more dramatic than it really is." Anne looked at Diana. "But imagine how disappointing life would be if nothing dramatic ever happened." "I think I would enjoy fewer tragedies than you would," Diana said honestly. Anne linked her arm through Diana's. "That's because you are sensible, Diana Barry, and I am imaginative." You certainly are something, Diana replied, laughing again. Jane Andrews adjusted the books in her arms thoughtfully. We should write our stories down. Anne stopped walking so suddenly that Diana nearly collided with her. Jane Andrews, she said solemnly, that is one of the finest ideas anyone has ever spoken out loud. Anne's eyes were shining. She was serious. No, truly, she continued excitedly, we could create an actual story club. We could meet every week and read our stories to one another. We should have rules, Ruby added importantly. And a beautiful name, Anne declared immediately. Something poetic and inspiring. After several very serious minutes of discussion and several rather dreadful suggestions, the group finally agreed upon calling themselves the Story Club. Anne secretly thought the name lacked grandeur. The first meeting was held at Green Gables the following Saturday afternoon. Anne spent nearly the entire morning preparing. She polished the kitchen table even though it already looked perfectly clean. She arranged the chairs carefully in a circle. She gathered tiny spring flowers because she believed that creative gatherings required beauty. Marilla watched all of this quietly while kneading bread. For goodness sakes, Anne, she finally said, they're coming to tell stories, not to attend a royal banquet. But atmosphere matters enormously. Great thoughts cannot survive in dull surroundings. Matthew hid a smile behind his coffee cup. When the girls finally arrived, Anne greeted them as though they were famous authors attending an all-important literary meeting. The story club began very solemnly, at least for the first few minutes. Anne opened the meeting with a dramatic speech about imagination and the importance of stories. Then the readings began. Most of the stories involved tragic illnesses, beautiful heroines, mysterious strangers, storms at sea, lost children, or heartbreak so dramatic people often fainted from sorrow. Anne approved of all these subjects. Diana's story was gentle. It involved two childhood friends separated for many years before finding one another again beneath blooming apple trees. There, Diana said shyly after finishing. Nobody drowned. That is because you possess a peaceful soul, Anne informed her. My imagination unfortunately longs for catastrophe. Everyone laughed. Then it was Anne's turn. Anne stood beside the kitchen table, holding her pages dramatically. Her story involved a tragic orphan girl, a stormy coastline, a mysterious disappearance, and at least 3 moments where characters burst into tears beneath dark skies. As Anne read, the room became completely still. Even Ruby stopped fidgeting. Diana watched Anne carefully. Nobody else told stories the way Anne did. When Anne imagined something, she seemed to disappear inside it completely. By the end of the story, one character had vanished forever, another was wandering the earth heartbroken, and a third was presumed dead after a terrible boating accident. Anne lowered the final page breathlessly. Silence filled the kitchen for half a second. Then everyone began speaking at once. That was terribly sad. You must finish it next week. I thought that girl was truly going to die. Diana was laughing so hard she nearly had tears in her eyes. Anne Shirley, she said, trying to catch her breath, why must every person in your stories either disappear, nearly drown, or die tragically? Because ordinary endings are dreadfully disappointing, Anne replied immediately. I thought the heroine was going to survive happily, said Diana. She almost did, Anne admitted thoughtfully. Then the storm made everything much more emotional. After the readings had ended, the girls stayed gathered around the kitchen table for far longer than they intended. Outside, the evening shadows stretched across the yard. The girls talked over one another excitedly, suggesting story ideas and dramatic endings. At one point, Diana laughed and said, if Anne ever writes a story about Avonlea, by the end, half of the town will probably be lost at sea. Even Marilla, passing through the kitchen with folded laundry, hid a small smile after hearing that. Anne felt happiness listening to everyone talk and laugh around the table. It was such a lovely feeling, sitting in a warm kitchen surrounded by people who cared about imagination the same way she did. For so long, Anne had carried entire worlds around inside herself, alone. Now she had people to share them with. As the weeks passed, Story Club became one of Anne's favorite parts of life. The girls took turns hosting meetings in kitchens or in backyards whenever the weather turned warm enough. Sometimes they wrote adventure stories, and sometimes tales that made almost no sense at all. But none of that mattered very much. What mattered was how alive everyone felt while creating them. One evening after a story club meeting, Anne and Diana walked slowly home beneath the soft golden sunlight. "Do you think," Diana asked thoughtfully, "that we shall always tell stories when we grow up?" Anne looked out across the glowing fields. "I hope so," she answered quietly. Anne knew that stories made life feel bigger, brighter, more meaningful somehow. And lately, Anne had begun noticing something else, too. Stories did not only help people escape life for a little while, sometimes stories help people understand themselves better, too. Though Anne didn't fully realize it yet, that lesson would soon become much more important than she imagined. Chapter 29. A Very Unfortunate Shade of Green. By the time spring settled fully over Avonlea, the world had become almost painfully beautiful. Apple blossoms drifted through the air like pink, pale snowflakes. The fields around Green Gables glowed soft green beneath the sunshine. And the birds sang so loudly in the mornings that Anne sometimes felt the whole world had turned cheerful on purpose. And yet, despite all this beauty, Anne Shirley was unhappy. Very unhappy. Specifically, Anne Shirley was unhappy with her hair. She had tried for years to make peace with it. Truly, she had. But every time she caught sight of those bright red braids in the mirror, disappointment twisted painfully inside her all over again. Red hair felt dreadful enough on ordinary days, but lately it seemed even worse somehow. Anne had become convinced her hair was her greatest tragedy. One afternoon she sat gloomily by the kitchen window, twisting one braid around her finger while Marilla worked nearby. "People who are born beautiful do not understand how unfortunate it is to have red hair," Anne sighed. Marilla did not look up from her work. "Red hair never harmed anybody's character. You spend entirely too much time thinking about your looks," said Marilla. Anne sighed deeply. "You do not understand the suffering of my soul, Marilla." One afternoon, something happened that seemed almost miraculous. Anne had gone into town on an errand when she noticed a strange little man standing beside a wagon filled with bottles and boxes. A crowd had gathered around him. The man spoke quickly and confidently while waving a small bottle dramatically through the air. "An absolutely remarkable product," he declared, "guaranteed to transform dull, faded, unfortunate hair into rich and beautiful black." Anne stopped walking immediately. Beautiful black hair. Her heart nearly stopped. She edged closer. The man continued, "No more embarrassment, no more disappointment. A simple application and your troubles vanish entirely." Anne's imagination burst into life all at once. She pictured herself with dark, glossy hair falling in soft waves around her face. Elegant, mysterious, beautiful, certainly no longer tragic. The little bottle seemed to glow in Anne's eyes like pure possibility. By the time she reached Green Gables again, Anne had almost convinced herself destiny had placed that salesman directly in her path. For the next 2 days, she tried very hard to forget him. She truly did. But the thought of beautiful black hair followed her everywhere. Finally, temptation defeated her completely. Using money she had carefully saved, Anne secretly purchased the bottle. She hid it beneath her bed upstairs and spent nearly the entire next day feeling nervous and excited all at once. That evening, Marilla and Matthew went into town. Anne suddenly found herself alone at Green Gables. This was it. By bedtime, she might become an entirely different person. Anne carried warm water to her room and placed the bottle carefully beside the basin. For one brief moment, she hesitated. What if something went wrong? But then she imagined herself waking up the next morning with shining dark hair. That settled the matter completely. Very carefully, Anne followed the directions exactly as best she could. The liquid smelled dreadful, but Anne endured it bravely for the sake of beauty. When she finally finished, she wrapped her hair carefully and waited impatiently for the proper amount of time to pass. Then, trembling with excitement, Anne washed the dye from her hair. At first, she couldn't tell whether or not it had worked. Her wet hair hung heavily around her shoulders as she leaned in toward the mirror. Then, slowly, Anne's smile disappeared. Her hair was dark, very dark, but not beautiful glossy black. Instead, it had become a dreadful, muddy, greenish black color, unlike anything Anne had ever seen before in her entire life. She stared at it in horror. Her hair was ruined, absolutely ruined. Anne sank onto the bed in complete misery. By the time Marilla returned home later that evening, Anne had worked herself into such despair that she could hardly speak properly. Marilla immediately knew something disastrous had happened. "Anne Shirley," she said, "what have you gone and done now?" Anne turned slowly toward her. For one stunned moment, neither of them spoke. "Anne," she said at last, her voice dangerously close to laughter, "what on earth possessed you?" Anne burst into fresh tears immediately. "I thought it was going to be black," she wailed. "The man guaranteed it. I cannot live like this. I shall never leave this room again. People will stare at me everywhere I go." "Well," Marilla said practically, "crying won't improve it any." But even Marilla's voice sounded gentle, because she could see Anne's humiliation was very real. Anne spent the next week avoiding mirrors whenever possible. Unfortunately, avoiding other people proved much harder. The girls at school noticed immediately. Some tried not to laugh. Anne felt every glance like a tiny sting. Finally, Marilla announced there was only one solution. It must be cut off. Anne looked horrified. For one dramatic moment, Anne thought this might truly be the worst tragedy of her entire young life. But deep down, she knew Marilla was right. So the next evening, Anne sat silently in a chair while Marilla cut away the ruined hair. When it was over, her remaining hair curled awkwardly around her face in short, uneven waves. Anne stared at herself in the mirror miserably. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Anne sat quietly beside her bedroom window looking out across the moonlit fields surrounding Green Gables. The world outside looked peaceful. Anne rested her chin against her knees with a long, unhappy sigh. She still thought her hair looked dreadful. Nothing about it resembled the beautiful, glossy black hair she had imagined. Sitting there quietly beneath the moonlight, Anne began to think about how much time she had spent wishing to look different. She had imagined black hair would somehow make everything easier, but instead, she had only ended up more unhappy than before. And little by little, as the moonlight filled the quiet room, Anne began feeling that maybe, even with stubborn red hair and disastrous mistakes and all, happiness could not be found in becoming someone else entirely. And this is where we'll pause for today, brave hearts. But before we move on, let's think about the parts of today's stories that felt big, surprising, uncomfortable, or important. Maybe you noticed how excited Anne felt while rehearsing for the play with the other students, or the way the whole room seemed to come alive with everyone working together to create costumes, practicing scenes, and telling stories. Maybe you noticed how proud Anne felt standing on the stage and realizing stories could make complete strangers feel the same thing at the same time. Or maybe the part that stayed with you the most was what happened afterward, the way Anne became so focused on changing herself that she began believing different hair might somehow make her happier too, and how quickly excitement turned into regret when everything went terribly wrong. Think back for a moment. What feelings showed up inside you while you listened to the story today? Because these chapters carried many big feelings inside of it. Some feelings appeared during the excitement of the play and story club. Others showed up later during Anne's mistake with the hair dye. And sometimes that's how feelings work in real life, too. Several different feelings can exist inside the very same story. So let's name the big feelings we heard in today's story, because when feelings have names, they often feel a little easier to understand. The big feelings in today's story were inspiration, comparison, and regret. Inspiration. Inspiration is the feeling that makes us excited to create, imagine, or try something new. Miss Stacy inspired the students when she announced the play and encouraged everyone to work together creating costumes, practicing scenes, and performing in front of an audience. Anne felt inspired while acting on stage and later while creating stories with Diana and the Story Club. For Anne, imagination makes the world feel bigger and brighter. Maybe you have felt inspiration after hearing a beautiful song, reading a story that you loved, drawing something that you felt proud of, or watching someone else do something that made you think, maybe I could try that too. Comparison. Comparison happens when we begin measuring ourselves against other people and quietly wondering if life would feel easier if we were more like them somehow. Anne feels this very strongly when she notices other girls with dark curls and pretty braids. Little by little, she begins believing her red hair is the most important thing about her. And once that thought settles into her mind, it grows larger and larger until she can hardly stop thinking about it. Comparison can make people forget their own wonderful qualities because they become too busy focusing on what somebody else has instead. A lot of people feel comparison sometimes. Maybe it is wishing that you looked different, or feeling like somebody else seems prettier or smarter or funnier or more confident than you. And the last big feeling we heard today was regret. Regret is that heavy feeling that can show up after we make a choice we wish we could undo. Anne feels regret almost immediately after seeing her hair turn that dreadful greenish black color. What began as excitement suddenly became disappointment, panic, and embarrassment all at the same time. Sometimes regret feels small, and sometimes it feels enormous, especially when we hoped something would turn out very differently. But one thing I notice in today's story is that Anne kept moving forward anyway, even after the mistake, even after everything went wrong. And that matters, because growing up does not happen by never making mistakes. A lot of growing happens after mistakes, when we slowly begin understanding what those hard moments are trying to teach us. So, as you think back on today's story, you might quietly wonder, have I ever compared myself to someone else before? I know I have. Or have I ever made a choice that I wished I could undo? And what inspires me to be creative, brave, or fully myself? You don't have to have all the answers right away. Sometimes simply noticing your feelings is enough. I had such a good time reading with you today. Now, let's slow everything down together for a moment. Take one slow breath in and a gentle breath out. I want you to remember you are still learning, still growing, still figuring things out one step at a time. And you are allowed to take your time while you do. Until we meet again, Bravehearts, keep noticing your thoughts and your feelings. And remember, you do not have to become someone else to matter. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to Girls Who Rise so you don't miss a single episode. I can't wait to keep reading with you and discover where Anne's journey takes us next. Until next time, Bravehearts, see you soon.